When it comes to mastering your craft, there are going to be so many different challenges that are going to come your way. And in the modern world, one of the main ones is being able to burn away superficial interests. These interests that will come into the forefront of your attention and vie for that attention and pull you away from the necessary work that you're needing to apply to your craft in order to reach a stage of being not only proficient, but masterful at what it is that you do. And you have to be aware of this. My name is Joe Yulee, by the way, and I'm a philosopher. I am absolutely obsessed with vocations and paths, and I typically work with people that are spiritually and creatively inclined. And it's so important that we understand what our calling is and are able to pursue it in our adult life. So that is why I'm here educating people on places like YouTube, Instagram, Substack. I host a podcast called the Archetypes podcast. It's why I show people step by step how to unearth their very own career archetype, which allows them to choose the right career path with conviction. Because we all have a calling in this life. And to not know what our calling is, I think, is an absolute tragedy. But to live our lives in pursuit of that calling, to eventually fulfill it, I think is a deeply meaningful existence. And on the road to pursuing your own vocation, your own calling, you're going to have these challenges popping up. You're going to have challenges like, how do I find the source root knowledge of my craft, really getting to the very base and first principles of my craft, because there are different conventions within any sort of subject domain, and you have to get to the core of it all. And then oftentimes what ends up happening is that you might find things aren't quite correct, they might be a little bit different, and you have to have the courage to break from these conventions and end up creating new forms or new ways or new approaches, which often happens to people in the later stages of their craft. And there are also challenges like seeking out the right guidance, seeking out the right mentorship, finding the right person to listen to and to guide you to where it is that you're meant to be going. Challenges like the constant repetition that is required in the work, and not only the repetition of it all, because you hear of these ideas such as the 10,000 hour rule or the 10 dark years law. And essentially what these are talking about is there's a long period of time before people really reach a stage of mastery when it comes to their craft, and being able to put in that time, but being also able to expand yourself through that process of repetition. It's not just simply about doing it again and again and again, but it's about being able to go beyond the limits of what you've been doing repeatedly and pushing yourself and expanding yourself, improving in these sort of outer areas to be able to go to that next level of whatever it is that your craft is. If you were to think about a painting, and maybe we take the example of Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali, in the early stages of his artistic career, really mimicked a lot of the great masters. He learned their style, and he was doing these different forms and expressions within the confines of the styles that he was inspired by. And then later on, once he knew the conventions and he knew the rules, he ended up going beyond that, broke these rules, and had his own signature style where you could see his true expression coming through, which was the latest stage of mastery. And on the road to getting to this later stage of mastery, the modern world is going to present you with noise. So much noise is out there. If you are to just simply pull yourself back and observe the world as to how it's operating right now, you'll notice that the majority of people have their head down, looking at their phone, and they're doing this, right? They're doing this, scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. They're consuming, they're consuming, they're consuming. All of these different sort of social media pings are hitting them and pulling their attention away from what it is that their craft is all about. And rather than working on their craft, they're thinking about a previous reel or a YouTube video or a podcast episode or something that their friends said. They heard some sort of gossip, or maybe they saw a comment right underneath a picture, and suddenly they're investigating this comment and seeing who knows who and who's married to who, and they're looking at the social relationships of the peer group that they used to have within high school, and they're just totally disengaged from their own personal craft. And a lot of this comes from these external forces, which is why I mentioned it's more of a modern problem that I'm pointing at, because we're being bombarded with all these different superficial distractions and superficial interests, so much so that we are ignoring the actual craft that we're meant to be putting our time and our effort and our attention into, simply because we opened up an app, one that has been strengthened in terms of the habitual routine just because of time and our place in this reality in the 21st century. And this is really important to understand, that superficial interest will come in and ping you and tell you to go and look into these other areas, that the actual work that you're meant to be doing, the work that will take you towards what I call as your exalted form, your highest level of being, is being neglected because of this stuff. And it's very, very easy for me to say, just stop looking at superficial interests. However, when we just start to say stop looking at superficial interests, we often are already connected in an unconscious way to these different pings that allow us to spontaneously go away from what it is that we're meant to be connecting into. And when this happens, we have to catch ourselves in these moments. Now, the way to catch yourself isn't simply by saying, I need to catch myself, right? It's not just this game of pure willpower. And some people can make out like it's just, hey, you just have to will it. Every single time that you feel a little bit distracted, you just got to chain yourself to the desk and you just have to just ignore it. And that's not fully right because it doesn't really address the core. And the core is that you have a calling in this life, something that only you can do, something that will bring deep meaning to your existence. And you have to be connected to that calling. And you have to be connected not simply in its awareness, right? You don't simply know about it and say, okay, because I know what my calling is, therefore I'm not going to get distracted anymore. It doesn't work like that. You have to devote yourself to your calling. Now, this is really the main way that I've seen in which it can help people to begin to get rid of these superficial interests that come into their existence. Only through devotion to what it is that they're meant to be doing in this existence. And when I say devotion, I mean this deep, almost religious devotion to your craft. And for some people, potentially, it is religious. It's ritualistic in its, I have to go and be in connection with my vocation and my calling on a consistent basis. You'll see that writers will often talk about having their own personal writing routines. Maybe it's every single day, or maybe they have a certain amount of words that they have to do over a week. And that consistent devotion to their craft, that I'm going to show up and do this because I feel it is what I'm meant to be doing. It's what I have to do, right? It's not what I need to do, it's what I have to do. When they get that sort of connection, then these different superficial interests that come on in, it's much easier for them to say, that's not what it's about. That's not where my life is headed. I'm not meant to be doing it and pursuing those different superficial interests at this moment in time. And so there are many different ways that superficial interests can infiltrate into your conscious way of being and into your life and into the times that maybe you've even specified for rich, deep work. Maybe it's from, like I mentioned, social media, which acts like a sort of slot machine that people are just, cranking the lever and just watching the different icons pop up. I mean, it's so similar, by the way, if you were to think about people sitting at slot machines. I remember when I was in Vegas, and I just noticed that there were just so many people sitting at these slot machines, just like drones. It's the same thing with scrolling. And when people go about that kind of behavior, they do just get sort of consumed by it, and it's taking over their mind. But it might also be, hey, I've got some spare time to be able to work on my craft in the morning. And you go and you set up your station or your little office at home, preparing to begin work on whatever your craft is. And then you hear that someone else in the house, maybe you're living with someone, maybe it's your sister, and she's in the kitchen. and you hear that she's in the kitchen, and you know that you've got your work to do, but you hear her out there, and you know what, maybe I should just go and ask her what she's up to. Maybe I should just get up off my desk and go and talk to her, right? Because you're just interested in what she's doing and how she's going about her life, or maybe you're just interested in why she's up that early. And so you go and you do that, and then suddenly you've pulled yourself once again away from what it is that you're meant to have your attention to. And if you're constantly getting pulled away from your craft, and I mentioned before that even just the time on average for people to reach mastering their craft can look like 10,000 hours, can look like 10 dark years. If you're constantly getting pulled away from your craft, then all of a sudden, it's not simply just 10,000 hours or 10 dark years. I mean, that time frame is with the understanding that person is deeply devoted with that time frame in mind, meaning that they spent the majority of that time pursuing their work rather than getting pulled away to ask their sister in the kitchen what she's up to and why she's up so early. And I thought you had work today, so I didn't realize you were going to be around. And suddenly the time frame expands. Right? So suddenly it goes from like 10 years of being able to master your craft to 20 years being able to master your craft. Now, obviously, this is me just giving you an approximation of what this can look like. But every single time we get pulled away from what it is that we're meant to be doing, our calling, we're losing that time to these distractions. And the deeper realization that needs to be had is that you're living a mortal existence. You're not immortal yet. The life expectancy is going up, which is great, but it's not gone up to the point where we have 500 years to live, right? You've probably got 100 years. The first 20 years, you don't, maybe even the first 25 years, you don't even really know what's going on, right? Your prefrontal cortex isn't even turned on. You're completely just chaotic in that moment. And after about the age of 25, then you start to wake up and start to look around and say, oh, I have to get my self together and figure out what it is that I want to spend my time doing. And even as you're trying to do that, you've likely already walked down a particular path. Maybe you're graduating from a degree. Maybe you already have a particular job or a trade. Maybe you've already started a business and that business isn't quite exactly what it is that you want to be known for, or you want to do with your time for the rest of your existence, and you're in this chaotic moment of trying to figure everything out. And then you have a period of your work life once you sort of have your feet on the ground and know what it is that you're meant to be doing. And that can be anywhere between, 30 years old to 65 years old, maybe higher because the life expectancy is going up. But that's the amount of time that you sort of have to really devote yourself to your craft. Now, if we were to break that down even further, if you are to spend the first 10 years from 30 to 40 years old, as an example, really devoting yourself to mastery and to your craft, then all of a sudden you've got about 20, 25 years of really being able to just express high quality work that you feel is like, that is amazing, that is what I wanted it to be. Because that's one of the things that often happens, especially in the creative domains, is that you have an idea of how you want something to be expressed. And obviously as it comes out and it starts to be expressed, it can change and morph and evolve over time as you get more and more information and insights from, we can say, the muses. And it morphs and changes over time. And being able to map it clearly through the skill set that you've attained through the years of mastery is something that very, very few people ever get to. And the reason that very, very few people ever get to it is because it's so hard to attain, and it's only getting harder. You'd think in the modern world that it would be getting easier to attain mastery, but because of the level of distractions that are coming in and the amount of information that is available, that leads to paralysis, that also leads to a lot of noise. We don't get the source root material that is going to give us solid principles and grounded information that can tell us how to go forward and execute on these things. It can lead us to having a harder time to attain mastery, which again is why being devoted to your craft is so crucial in the modern era. Because if you're not truly devoted to your craft, all of a sudden, all this different information, all these different distractions, all these different whispers are just going to make it that much harder for you to ever really do what it is that you're meant for and pursue and reach your exalted form. Now, devotion acts like an anchor point. And the way that that works is that you can imagine a boat out at sea and it's moving around. And this isn't really how a boat moves, but it's moving around. The moment that you drop the anchor, it can stay in that position. And it's solid in that position. And you can get out of the boat and get into another smaller boat, and you can go off to an island and you can explore, but you can always come back to the main boat. And being deeply devoted to your craft can work in the same way, meaning that you can venture off, right? Let's say, for example, you do get distracted because you're human and people will get distracted every now and then, and that's totally normal. Maybe there's a chaotic event out in the world and all of a sudden you're getting pulled into that event and you have to think about it because it directly impacts your life. Now, if you don't have that devotion in place, you might get completely consumed by that for 6 months or longer. It was wild when I ended up watching the pandemic when it came around with COVID, and suddenly people made this the center point of their vocation. And I watched this completely consume people that had never really spoken about anything within this domain before in their lives. And yet, when the pandemic hit and everyone was talking about it, suddenly they wanted to make it the center point of their vocation. And so they did that. They did that for years. And then it's faded off. And then I saw a lot of people just losing their way during that period. Because when it faded off, what ended up happening is that they started to realize this isn't actually the thing that I wanted to be talking about with my life. It's just the thing that I got consumed by during that period of time. And people that really were meant to speak in that period were people that were engaged within sort of the media and journalism zones of our society, as well as people that are in the medical zones, and they likely would have already been interested in pandemics prior to it even happening. Or maybe there was a realization when it did happen that, oh, I really do want to spend the rest of my life looking at this stuff, and they'd still be looking at it intensely and obsessively right now, even though no one is even talking about it anymore, and people really don't want to even talk about it anymore. And that's a sign that it is the right calling when no one really cares and you still care. And so I watched people get completely consumed by this, what I would call for many of them was a very superficial interest. And because they got so consumed with this, it ended up leading them away from the hours that they could have spent pouring in to what it is that they're actually meant to be doing in this existence. Another sort of example of where this happened more recently was I saw on YouTube, and you'll see these deadly algorithms that they just pull you away, they pull your attention away, they tell you to go and click this thing, and they try to make these like thumbnails like pull you in and grip you, or these titles pull you in and grip you. But there was a video going viral, and the video that was going viral was a Joe Rogan and Donald Trump interview. And so they had the president of the United States, oh, he's not the president anymore, the previous president of the United States on a podcast. And I think it was about 7 hours, and it already had millions and millions and millions of views on it. And this video was 3 hours long, right? That was a long period of time. Now, unless you are somebody that is deeply engaged with politics, or somebody that is deeply affected by certain circumstances that are going to happen, whether that person gets elected or not, it's probably a distraction. It's probably a superficial interest that isn't really going to help you with your calling, especially if you're somebody that is creatively inclined or spiritually inclined. A lot of these types of the moment news arenas that come out are things that are going to pull you off your craft. And if you don't have devotion, that anchor point saying like, hey, this isn't that important. What is important is you pouring your being into the work and the effort required to do that, is more of necessity right now. That's where you need to really do your work. If you don't have that, then you just flitter away and you go with the crowd and you go with what everyone else is looking at, talking about, and you lose yourself in those moments. But if you have this level of devotion, and the level of devotion that I'm talking about here, one image that comes to my mind is I remember hearing about these different, I think it was Buddhist monks, and there was a certain group of them that would wake up before sunrise and they would just meditate for 8 hours straight. So they just wake up, don't eat, and they just sit there and they just meditate upright for 8 hours. And they do that every single day, day after day after day. Like maybe you could do that for a month, maybe you could do that, do one of these 90-day challenges or something. But I'm talking that these people did it for year after year after year after year. And that was what they were devoted to. They were devoted to their practice and their craft. And that's the sort of level of devotion that I'm talking about. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to simply look at this like a metric of hours attained. But what it means is that every single day, are you connecting in to your craft? Are you really tuning into it so that when these different distractions appear, you can say and look at that like, no, that's not for me today. Right? Rather than being pulled by impulse and being pulled by the moment, you connect back in and you say, no, that isn't important. You know what is important? My craft, the thing that I am deeply devoted to. And that's why devotion just burns away superficial interests, because it has this ability to filter all of these interests through the main thing. And the main thing is you embodying and being your calling and your purpose. So whatever your calling, your purpose is, and pursuing that path, it will slowly transform you into that, so long as you are pursuing it diligently and, like I said, with devotion. And if you are doing that, every single time, say for example, you've got the app on your phone, and I would highly encourage people just to delete those social media apps off their phones because they are such, deterrence from what it is that you are meant to be doing. But let's say you had a Instagram on your phone and you see it there and you click on it and then suddenly you're in the reels, right? And you're scrolling and you're scrolling. If you are connected to your craft, or let's say, for example, you connected to your craft earlier in the morning, it's going to be a lot easier for you to self-talk and catch yourself in those moments and say, hey, this isn't what it's about. And by getting rid of them and getting off the app, pulling yourself out, and maybe you don't need to do any more work in your craft because you've already spent some time doing work in your craft. Maybe it's time for rest, and that's not the best way to rest. But by being able to consciously pull yourself out because you can filter yourself, you can access this higher state of who you are and have the ability to say no to things, it will give you back your sense of, oh, I meant to put my energy into this area of life. This is actually what I chose. This is actually the direction that I'm meant to be walking. And if you're interested in learning more about devotion, maybe you're even interested in knowing what your craft is and how to choose it and how to know it with conviction, then I would encourage you to check out our Unearth membership, where I show students step by step how to choose the right career path with conviction. And the way that we do this is we go over a multi-perspective viewpoint of who it is that you are. And we look at you through many different lenses. And by gathering all this self-knowledge, we have the right material to take you through this naming ritual where you're able to bring forth what your calling is and what I call your career archetype. And you'll learn the name of your career archetype. We have a list of over 450 career archetypes at the moment within the space, and that list is growing every single day. So if you're interested in that, then go ahead and check the link below.